A millionaire in a sky-blue suit was walking through the park when he saw a little girl lying motionless on the grass. He didn't know her name, he didn't know her story, but fate did. What happened next would change his life forever. Stay till the end, because this story will touch your heart and remind you that sometimes the richest hearts are born from kindness, not money. The golden afternoon light spilled softly across the park, brushing every leaf and flower with a gentle, warm glow. Children's laughter filled the air like music, chasing through the breeze, echoing off the pond, and wrapping around the benches where couples and families sat together. Kites danced lazily above, their ribbons twirling in the sky like dreams that refused to fade. Mothers watched their toddlers take uncertain steps while fathers pushed strollers and smiled proudly at every small giggle. But at the far end of the park, away from the laughter and chatter, sat a man alone. His name was Mason Carter, 36 years old, polished, successful, and outwardly perfect. To the world, he was a symbol of triumph, the man who had built an empire from nothing. But to himself, he was just a shadow. A man surrounded by everything money could buy, yet starving for something it never could. He wore a dark navy coat, crisp shirt, and expensive watch that gleamed in the sunlight. But his eyes told another story. They were cold, tired, and distant, holding a quiet storm no one else could see. Every few minutes he'd glance at the families passing by, a faint smile curving his lips before fading again. It wasn't jealousy he felt. It was something deeper, quieter, more painful. Longing. He watched a little boy run to his mother with open arms. She bent down, scooped him up, and kissed his cheek. Mason's chest tightened as he looked away, pretending to check his phone. He had all the success the world offered, but none of these simple moments that gave life its meaning. Behind his polished smile was a man who ate dinner alone, who came home to silence, who had forgotten the sound of being called Dad. The soft wind brushed past him, carrying the scent of blooming roses from the park garden. It should have been comforting, but instead it reminded him of another time, years ago, when he and Lily would walk hand in hand through this very park. He could still hear her laugh, light and carefree, echoing in his memory like a song he once loved but could no longer hum. They had dreamed of building a family, of Sunday mornings and little footsteps running through the halls. But dreams have a way of breaking when pride gets in the way. Business meetings, deadlines, and ambition had stolen the hours that belonged to love. Fights grew colder, words sharper, and soon, Lily's eyes stopped shining for him. One night, she packed her bags, tears falling down her cheeks as she whispered, "You've already chosen your world, Mason. And it's not me." The door closed, and with it, every color faded from his life. He told himself it was for the best. That love distracted men like him. But as years passed, he realized he hadn't just lost a wife. He'd lost himself. He buried himself in work, building higher walls, earning more zeros, chasing the illusion that success could silence the ache in his heart. But loneliness has a way of finding even the richest soul. Now, sitting there among laughter and sunlight, Mason felt like a ghost among the living. He didn't belong to their joy anymore. He only watched it from a distance. He leaned back on the bench, staring at the sky, wondering if Lily ever thought about him. He wondered where she was, if she had found happiness, if she had moved on. He didn't know that destiny was already walking toward him, wearing a white dress, holding a small blue balloon, and smiling at the world with his own eyes. Because just a few feet away, a little girl named Adeline was chasing butterflies with all the joy her small heart could hold. And without knowing it, she was about to walk straight into the arms of the man who had once believed he had lost everything. The man who didn't know that the world had secretly given him one last chance, a chance to find his heart again through his daughter. The marble fountain stood proudly in the center of the park, its clear water dancing in the air like silver ribbons. The sunlight kissed every drop, turning them into diamonds that sparkled as they fell. Children played around it, tossing pennies and whispering wishes they hoped the wind would carry to heaven. Among them, a little girl stood out, Adeline. Her laughter was soft and pure, like the chime of tiny bells carried by the breeze. Her blonde hair shimmered under the golden afternoon light, curling slightly at the ends, bouncing with every step she took. Her little white dress fluttered around her knees, spotless, glowing almost like it had borrowed the sun's warmth. In one hand, she held a blue balloon, its string wrapped carefully around her fingers, as if it was her best friend in the world. She ran across the grass barefoot, chasing a butterfly that danced just out of reach. Every time she almost caught it, she giggled and twirled, her voice mixing with the sounds of splashing water and distant music from an ice cream cart. People passing by couldn't help but smile at her. She was the kind of child who reminded the world that innocence still existed, that joy didn't need a reason. An old woman feeding pigeons whispered, "What a sweet little angel." A young couple nearby smiled, watching her skip. "She's like sunshine," they said. But Adeline wasn't watching anyone. Her world was simple and bright. It was full of butterflies, clouds shaped like animals, and dreams too big for her tiny heart. She finally stopped by the fountain, her cheeks pink, chest rising with soft breaths. She leaned over the water, staring at her reflection. Her bright blue eyes blinked back at her, eyes filled with curiosity, with wonder, with a light that could melt even the coldest heart. She dipped her small fingers into the water, giggling as it rippled. "Hi, me," she whispered to her reflection, the innocence of her voice echoing softly under the sound of flowing water. But a few benches away, someone was watching her. Not in the way strangers do, but with a strange pull, an ache, a flicker of something he didn't understand. It was Mason Carter. He hadn't meant to stare. He wasn't the kind of man who noticed strangers' children. But this little girl, something about her stirred something deep in his chest. He didn't even know her name, yet his eyes followed her every movement, as if his soul recognized something his mind couldn't. Her smile, the way her nose crinkled when she laughed, the way she tilted her head slightly when curious. It all felt hauntingly familiar. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was nothing, but his heart had started to beat faster, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt his throat tighten. "She looks like," he whispered to himself, then stopped. "Like who?" He didn't want to finish that thought. As Adeline lifted her balloon toward the sunlight, the string slipped from her fingers for just a moment. She reached up, catching it again, laughing at her near miss, completely unaware that destiny had already woven her path toward the man watching her. Mason leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, unable to take his eyes off her. He saw himself in her, the shape of her chin, the soft curl of her hair. But more than that, he saw Lily, the woman he had once loved so deeply and lost so painfully. "Impossible," he whispered under his breath, almost afraid of his own thoughts. He forced himself to look away, but his heart didn't listen. There was something about that child that made the world around him fade. The laughter, the park, the sunshine, all became distant noise compared to the silent storm building inside his chest. Adeline began to hum a small tune as she walked along the fountain's edge, her tiny hands stretched out for balance. Mason watched in quiet awe, unaware that his entire life was about to change because of that little song, that little girl, that little heartbeat in white. For the first time in years, he felt something alive inside him, not the rush of power, not the thrill of money, but something fragile, tender, human. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know her story. But in that moment, he knew one thing. If she fell, if she stumbled, if she ever needed someone, he would be there. And destiny, silent and smiling, was already preparing to test that promise in the most heartbreaking way possible. Because in just a few moments that innocent laughter would fade, and the world would hold its breath as Adeline's tiny body collapsed near the fountain. And Mason, the man who believed he had lost everything, would discover that his heart still had a reason to beat. The gentle hum of the park had been peaceful only seconds before. Mason had stood from the bench brushing off his coat, ready to leave behind the warmth of other people's laughter. He told himself it was time to get back to his empty mansion, his meetings, his world of glass and gold. But destiny had other plans. From the corner of his eye, he saw the little girl, the one who had somehow captured his attention, twirl one last time near the fountain. Her blue balloon slipped from her hand and began to rise slowly, drifting toward the clouds. For a brief second, she laughed and reached up for it, jumping, her tiny arms stretching toward the sky. Then something changed. The joy in her face vanished. Her smile fell away. Her small hand clutched at her chest as if an invisible weight had struck her. Mason froze. The balloon drifted higher, spinning against the sunlight, while Adeline swayed unsteadily, her knees trembling. Time seemed to slow. The chatter of the park dimmed into a distant hum. And then she collapsed. Her tiny body hit the grass softly, her white dress fanning around her like a fallen flower. The sound of her fall was so light, yet it tore through Mason's heart like thunder. "Somebody help!" a woman shouted. A man dropped his ice cream cone. Children stopped laughing. The fountain kept singing, unaware that the most innocent soul nearby had just slipped into silence. But Mason didn't think, he moved. He ran toward her, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. He didn't even know her name, yet fear gripped him as though his own life depended on hers. He dropped to his knees beside her, his breath coming in short gasps. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, shaking. "Can you hear me? Please open your eyes." Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted, her chest rising only faintly. Mason's hands trembled as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. Her skin felt cold, fragile, like porcelain that might shatter if he pressed too hard. People began gathering in a circle, whispering, watching, but no one moved closer. "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted. But Mason didn't wait. The panic in his chest was too heavy, too unbearable. He could hear his own heart pounding louder than the crowd. Without another word, he lifted her into his arms, gently, desperately, as if she were made of light. Her head rested against his chest, and he could feel how weak her breathing was. "Stay with me, Angel," he murmured, his voice breaking. "You're going to be okay. Just stay with me, please." Her eyelids fluttered for a moment, her lips moving faintly, but no sound came out. Then she went still again. Mason's breath caught. He pressed her closer against him, his hands trembling as he carried her toward the parking lot. Every step felt heavier, every second slower. He didn't even feel the stairs around him. The world had narrowed down to the small heartbeat against his chest. He reached his car, pulled the door open, and gently placed her on the passenger seat. For a second, he looked at her, this little stranger whose life now rested in his hands, and something in him cracked wide open. He remembered the nights Lily used to dream aloud about children, about laughter in their home. He had said someday, maybe, but someday never came. Now, looking at this fragile girl, Mason felt an ache deep in his soul, as if life was giving him a second chance, wrapped in terror. He started the car, tires screeching against the pavement. The park grew smaller in his rearview mirror, the sound of people shouting fading behind him. His knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. "Hold on, sweetheart," he whispered again, glancing at her motionless form beside him. "Don't you dare give up on me." The hospital wasn't far, but every red light felt like a lifetime. He ignored them all, his only focus the faint rise and fall of her tiny chest. Her small hand slipped slightly from her lap, and he reached over, holding it tightly with his own. It was ice cold. "Please," he muttered, voice trembling, "please don't let anything happen to her." He didn't know why he cared so much, but deep inside, something told him this moment wasn't just chance. It was fate. As the hospital came into view, Mason pressed harder on the accelerator. His heart pounded with fear, guilt, and a strange, unknown emotion that felt painfully close to love. When he screeched to a stop at the emergency entrance, doctors and nurses rushed toward him. He jumped out, yelling for help, his voice raw. "She fainted in the park. She's not waking up." They took her from his arms, laying her on a stretcher, and disappeared through the sliding doors. Mason stood there, hands shaking, his chest rising and falling rapidly, watching the doors close behind her. And as the automatic doors sealed shut, so did the moment that would change his life forever. He didn't know it yet, but the little girl he had just saved wasn't a stranger. She was the missing heartbeat his soul had been searching for all these years. His own daughter. The bright lights of the hospital lobby almost blinded Mason as he rushed in, carrying the little girl in his arms. "Help! Please, someone help her!" he shouted, his voice breaking raw with panic. Nurses immediately responded, wheeling over a stretcher. Mason gently laid the girl down, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He had never felt so powerless in his life. Doctors surrounded her, their words blending into a blur of medical terms he didn't understand. He could only stand there, frozen, watching strangers fight for the life of a child he didn't even know, yet somehow felt bound to. As they disappeared through the emergency room doors, the weight of silence hit him. The hallway suddenly felt too big, too cold, too empty. Mason pressed a hand against the wall to steady himself. His chest heaved, every breath shallow and uneven. He'd faced boardrooms, billion-dollar negotiations, and crisis meetings without ever losing composure. But this tiny, unconscious girl had shattered every ounce of his control. Minutes turned to what felt like hours. Mason paced the sterile hallway, his polished shoes tapping anxiously against the floor. He ran his hand through his hair again and again, unable to calm the storm inside him. Every time he blinked, he saw her pale little face, the way her fingers had gone limp in his grasp. He didn't know why it hurt so much. She was just a child, a stranger, and yet it felt like losing her would destroy him. "Sir?" a nurse called softly, breaking his thoughts. He turned quickly. "She's stable now," she said with a kind smile. "She fainted because of exhaustion and dehydration. She'll be just fine after some rest and fluids." Mason's shoulders dropped with relief. The air he'd been holding for what felt like eternity escaped in a long, shaky sigh. He closed his eyes, whispering, "Thank God." But before he could walk away, the nurse asked gently, "Are you her guardian, sir?" Her question hung in the air like a sharp blade. Mason froze. His throat tightened. I don't know," he stammered, confusion flickering in his eyes. "I just found her in the park. She fainted and I brought her here." The nurse nodded softly, noting down his words. "Well, you did the right thing. You saved her life." Then she smiled, a knowing motherly smile. "You were very brave." He gave a small, awkward nod, but inside her words cut deeper than she realized. "You saved her life." Those words echoed in his mind, filling it with questions he couldn't answer. Why did he care this much? Why did his heart ache so deeply for this little girl he had never met? It wasn't normal, it wasn't logical, yet it felt real. He sat down in the waiting area, elbows on his knees, staring blankly at the floor. The soft hum of machines, distant voices of doctors, and faint beeps from down the hall surrounded him. But all he could think of was the sound of her tiny heartbeat against his chest when he carried her. It was faint but alive. He could still feel it, that fragile rhythm that somehow synced with his own. The nurse walked back after a while. "She's awake now. You can see her if you'd like." He looked up, hesitant. "Me? I'm not—" "It's okay," she interrupted gently. "You're the one who brought her in. She's asking for the man who held her hand." Mason stood slowly, his pulse quickening again. She remembered him. He followed the nurse down a quiet corridor. Every step echoed like a heartbeat. He didn't know what to say or why his palms were sweating. He told himself he was just making sure she was okay, that once her family arrived, he would leave and never see her again. But deep inside, another voice whispered something different, something frighteningly tender. When he reached the small hospital room, he paused at the doorway. Through the glass, he saw her, the little girl, lying on the white bed, her blonde hair spread across the pillow like sunlight. An IV line ran to her tiny hand, and her stuffed bunny sat beside her as if guarding her dreams. Mason's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know her, yet seeing her safe filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Her small chest rose and fell softly. Her lips moved slightly, as if whispering something in her sleep. He stepped inside quietly, standing by her bedside, his tall frame casting a faint shadow over her. For a long moment, he just looked at her, memorizing the curve of her eyelashes, the softness of her features, the innocent calm that surrounded her. A thought crept into his mind, a strange, impossible thought that made his heart twist. Why does she look so much like Lily? He shook his head quickly, refusing to let the idea linger. It couldn't be. It was just coincidence. Still. When he looked at her again, his heart whispered what his mind refused to accept. Something about this little girl was pulling him somewhere he hadn't been in years, toward tenderness, toward fatherhood, toward love. He didn't know her story yet. He didn't know her name. But something told him this moment wasn't the end of their meeting. It was only the beginning. And as he stood there, watching her sleep peacefully, Mason Carter, the man the world knew as cold, composed, and untouchable, felt his first tear in years slide down his cheek. He didn't understand why. All he knew was that this child, this stranger, had already changed something inside him forever. The soft rhythm of the hospital monitor filled the quiet room. Adeline's tiny figure lay curled beneath the thin white blanket, her lashes resting on pale cheeks. The world outside moved fast, but inside that room, time seemed to stop. Mason stood by the door, his heart pounding in his chest. For reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Something about this little girl had pulled at a place in his heart he thought had died years ago. When her eyes slowly fluttered open, the faintest smile touched her lips. "You're the man who helped me, right?" she asked in a weak, breathy voice. Mason swallowed hard and nodded, moving closer. "Yes. I was really worried about you, sweetheart. You fainted in the park. You scared me half to death." She giggled softly, that pure, innocent sound that made his chest tighten. "You sound like Mommy when she worries." He smiled faintly, sitting beside her bed. "Mommy must love you very much." "She does," Adeline whispered, her voice trembling with both pride and sadness. "But she had to go to work. She said she'd come back soon." Mason's heart ached. He looked around the room, noticing a small crayon box and a folded paper on the side table. Curiosity tugged at him, and when he gently picked it up, his breath caught. It was a drawing, a child's drawing, full of bright colors and clumsy lines. A tall man stood beside a woman, their hands joined with a little girl between them. Above their heads, a messy rainbow arched like hope. "That's my family," Adeline said proudly, her eyes shining. "That's my daddy, my mommy, and me." Mason looked closer. The man in the picture had brown hair just like his own. The woman had golden curls, just like Lily's. A chill ran through him. "That's beautiful," he managed to whisper. "What's your daddy's name, sweetheart?" Adeline tilted her head, her small fingers tracing over the crayon faces. "Mommy says his name is Mason Carter." The world stopped. Mason's heart slammed against his ribs. His breath caught in his throat as his mind tried to make sense of what he'd just heard. He dropped to his knees beside her bed, staring at her tiny face. The soft curve of her cheeks, the shape of her eyes, that familiar spark he'd once seen in Lily. "Sweetheart," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. "What's your mommy's name?" "Lily," she said simply, smiling. "Lily Carter. Do you know her?" Mason's eyes burned. The air in the room seemed to vanish. He looked at the little girl, his little girl, and the realization tore through him like lightning. 6 years. 6 long years without knowing she existed. Without knowing his heart had been walking the world in the form of this small, fragile soul. He turned away, covering his face with his hand as tears welled up in his eyes. His whole body shook, not from anger, but from shock, regret, and love all at once. Adeline's soft voice broke the silence. "Why are you sad, mister?" He wiped his face quickly, forcing a trembling smile. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. Just surprised. You're very special, you know that?" She nodded proudly. "Mommy says I'm her sunshine, but she also says my daddy is her biggest mistake." Mason's heart shattered at the words. He wanted to speak, to explain, to shout that he never stopped loving her mother. But how could he? The little girl didn't understand the storms that tore grown-up hearts apart. He looked at the drawing again, his fingers tracing the three figures. The lines were uneven, but the meaning was clear. Somewhere deep inside, she had drawn the family she dreamed of, the one she'd never truly had. Mason leaned closer, brushing her hair gently from her forehead. "That's a beautiful dream, Adeline," he said softly. Maybe dreams like that come true sometimes." She yawned, curling up with her stuffed bunny. "Do you think my daddy would like me?" she asked sleepily. Mason's throat tightened, tears filling his eyes again. "More than anything in this world, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking. "More than anything." As she drifted back to sleep, Mason sat silently beside her, his hand trembling as he held the little drawing. It was more than paper and crayon. It was a bridge between two hearts that had been apart for far too long. In that quiet hospital room, under the soft hum of machines and the glow of evening light, Mason Carter finally realized that the emptiness he'd felt for years had a name, and that name was Adeline. The words echoed in Mason's mind like thunder rolling through a storm. "Mommy says Daddy was too busy for us, but I still love him." Each syllable sliced through his chest, cutting deep into the regrets he had buried years ago. He stood frozen beside the hospital bed, staring at Adeline, her wide blue eyes filled with innocence, her golden hair framing her face just like Lily's used to. Every tiny feature screamed a truth he wasn't ready for. Your mom's name is Lily?" he asked again, his voice trembling, desperate for reassurance, terrified of the answer. Adeline smiled, nodding proudly. "Yes, Mommy says Daddy was too busy for us, but I still love him." Those words struck harder than any pain he'd ever felt. Mason's chest tightened as if the air itself had turned to glass around him. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He forced a small smile for her sake and whispered, "You're a very brave little girl." But his voice cracked, betraying the storm building inside him. He turned toward the door, gripping the edge of the frame as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The moment he stepped into the hallway, the dam inside him broke. The cool hospital air hit his face, but it couldn't calm the fire in his heart. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His mind raced through every memory of Lily, her laughter, her tears, the night she'd walked out of his life. He remembered the fight, the words he couldn't take back. Back then, he had been too proud, too lost in work, too focused on becoming someone important. He never noticed how much she needed him, how much they had needed each other. Now, 6 years later, fate had dragged him into a sterile white hospital room to face the consequence of his choices, a daughter he had never known existed. He leaned against the wall, his heart pounding in his ears. The fluorescent lights above him blurred through the tears welling in his eyes. 6 years. He whispered to himself. "She's 6 years old." That meant Lily must have been pregnant when she left him. He clenched his fists, pain twisting inside him. Why didn't she tell me? He remembered her tearful face the night of their final argument. The way she had said, "You're too busy for love, Mason. You're building empires but breaking hearts." At the time, he thought she was just angry. He had no idea she was walking away not just for herself, but for a child she carried inside her. Now, standing in the hallway of a hospital, he felt the full weight of every missed birthday, every bedtime story never told, every hug that never happened. He sank onto a nearby bench, covering his face with his trembling hands. His shoulders shook as silent tears fell, not out of weakness, but out of unbearable grief. For years, he had lived in mansions but slept in loneliness. He had driven luxury cars but carried an empty heart. And all along, somewhere in the same city, his daughter had been growing up, without his love, without his protection, without his name. He thought about the way Adeline looked at him, the warmth in her eyes, the way she smiled as if she'd known him forever. It wasn't coincidence. Blood had recognized blood, even before his mind caught up. He whispered her name under his breath like a prayer. "Adeline, My little girl. The realization hit him so hard it nearly stole his breath. He pressed his palm to his chest, as if trying to hold his breaking heart together. He remembered how she'd fainted in his arms, how fragile she'd felt, how terrified he'd been. And now he knew why. That fear wasn't for a stranger. It was a father's fear, a fear he'd never known until now. Memories flooded back. The way Lily used to talk about wanting a daughter, how she'd said she'd name her after her grandmother, Adeline. He'd laughed back then, saying, "Oh, that's an old-fashioned name." Now that very name carried the weight of his redemption and his deepest regret. Mason stood slowly, wiping the tears from his eyes. His reflection in the glass door showed a man who looked successful but broken, a man who had built walls so high he couldn't even see what he'd lost behind them. He took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he whispered to himself, "I lost Lily once. I won't lose Adeline, too." Determination began to replace the shock. Somewhere in this city, Lily still lived, and she had raised their daughter alone. Mason knew what he had to do. He would find Lily. He would face the past he'd run from. And this time, he would fight. Not for money, not for pride, but for the family he never knew he had. Because in that moment, Mason Carter realized that all the power, all the luxury, all the fortune in his world meant nothing compared to the tiny heartbeat that had once fainted in his arms. The hallway was quiet when Mason saw her. Lily stood near the door of the hospital room, her golden hair pulled into a loose bun, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years of silence hung between them like an invisible wall. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Mason?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He rose slowly from the bench, every emotion he'd buried crashing over him at once. "Lily," he breathed, taking a cautious step forward. "It's really you." She looked fragile, like a ghost from a dream he thought he'd lost. The same soft face he once loved, the same eyes that used to shine with warmth. Only now they were filled with guilt and fear. He tried to smile, but his voice broke instead. "Why didn't you tell me, Lily?" Her lips quivered as she tried to find words. She looked down at the floor, her tears falling like quiet rain that no one could see, but both could feel. "You were building your empire," she whispered. "You were too busy. You barely had time for me. I didn't want to be one more thing that held you back." Mason shook his head slowly, disbelief and pain mixing in his eyes. "A burden? Lily, you were never a burden. You were everything." She took a shaky breath, her fingers twisting nervously. "I thought you moved on, Mason. I thought you didn't want me anymore. When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. I was scared and alone, and I didn't know how to tell you." Mason's chest ached as he closed the distance between them. "You thought I wouldn't care." His voice cracked under the weight of years of regret. "Lily, I lost everything that mattered when you walked away. The money, the company, none of it filled that hole. And now..." He looked toward the small hospital room where Adeline slept peacefully. "Now, I find out I have a daughter I never knew existed." Lily's shoulders shook as she covered her face, sobbing softly. "I made a mistake, Mason. I thought I was protecting her, protecting myself. I thought maybe one day I'd tell you, but every year that passed, it just got harder. I didn't know how to face you after so long." He gently reached out and took her hand. It was cold, trembling, just like the first night they'd danced under the stars years ago. "You should have told me," he said quietly. "I missed her whole life, Lily. Her first steps, her first words, the nights she cried for her daddy." Lily's tears fell harder. "She used to ask about you," she whispered. "She'd see other kids with their fathers and ask where hers was. I told her you were busy, but that you loved her in your own way." Mason's throat tightened. He wanted to be angry. Part of him was. But when he looked into Lily's eyes, all he saw was pain, pain that matched his own. He exhaled shakily, the words trembling on his lips. I should have come after you. I should have fought for us. She looked up at him, eyes shining with remorse. We were both young, Mason, both proud. I thought walking away was the right thing. But when Adeline was born, I saw you in her every day. Her eyes, her laugh, the way she asks endless questions. He smiled faintly through the ache in his heart. She's got my stubbornness, too. A tearful laugh escaped Lily's lips. Yes, and your smile. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Two broken souls standing in the wreckage of what once was. But amid the hurt, there was something else, too. Forgiveness trying to bloom. Mason finally whispered, I don't care how much time has passed. I just want to be part of her life now. She deserves that. We both do. Lily looked at him, her eyes searching his face for truth. And what she saw there wasn't the cold, distant businessman she'd left years ago. It was a man broken open, raw, and full of love. She's in the room, she said softly. Sleeping. Mason nodded, glancing toward the door. I know. I've been here since she fainted. I couldn't leave her side. Tears glistened in Lily's eyes again. You always did have a soft heart, she whispered. He smiled weakly. I just forgot how to use it for a while. Lily reached up and gently touched his face, her fingers trembling. Maybe it's not too late, she said. He covered her hand with his own. No, he whispered, his voice steady now, filled with quiet strength. It's not too late. I lost my family once. I won't lose you both again. And for the first time in years, Lily believed him. In that sterile hospital hallway, surrounded by the hum of machines and the faint sound of a child breathing behind a door, two hearts that had once broken each other began to mend, one trembling heartbeat at a time. The hospital room was dim that night, lit only by the soft amber glow of a bedside lamp. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking the silence, a rhythm that somehow matched the beating of Mason's own heart. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. His hands trembled as he gripped the doorframe, watching the tiny figure lying in the bed, the little girl he had unknowingly waited 6 long years to meet. Adeline stirred, her soft blonde hair spilling over the pillow. When her eyes fluttered open, her gaze found him. She smiled sleepily, her small voice barely a whisper. Mommy says you're my daddy. Mason's heart nearly stopped. He swallowed hard, stepping closer with careful, uncertain steps, as though afraid this fragile miracle might disappear if he moved too quickly. He sat beside her, the mattress dipping under his weight. Yes, he said softly, his voice breaking on the single word. Yes, sweetheart. I am. I'm your daddy. Adeline blinked up at him, her innocent eyes glimmering under the soft hospital light. Did you forget about me? She asked, not accusingly, but with the quiet honesty only a child could have. His breath caught. His throat burned as he shook his head, his voice trembling. No, sweetheart. I didn't forget you. I just didn't know. I didn't know you were out there. I'm so sorry I wasn't there before. I should have been. For a second, she just looked at him, studying his face, his eyes, the way his voice shook when he spoke. Then, with a tiny smile, she reached out her small hand and touched his cheek. Her skin was soft, her touch light as air. It's okay, Daddy, she whispered. You're here now. That simple sentence broke him completely. Mason's tears fell before he could stop them. He pressed his hand over hers, his chest shaking with silent sobs. All the years of loneliness, all the regret and missed birthdays, all the things he'd never said, they poured out of him like a flood. He leaned forward and gathered her carefully into his arms, afraid to hold too tight, afraid to let go. Adeline rested her tiny head against his shoulder, her small arms wrapping around his neck. For the first time in 6 years, Mason felt whole. He whispered against her hair, his voice cracking. I missed you so much. even before I knew you. Adeline smiled against his chest. Mommy says love finds people even when they don't see it. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes glistening. Your mommy is a very wise woman. She nodded. She said I got my stubbornness from you. He laughed through his tears, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. She's right about that, too. For a moment, the world outside that room didn't exist. Not the companies, not the money, not the people who called him powerful. None of it mattered. Right here, in this quiet hospital room, Mason Carter, the millionaire the world admired and envied, finally understood what real wealth meant. It wasn't found in his empire, his cars, or his reputation. It was in the heartbeat of the little girl resting against him. He kissed her forehead gently, whispering, I promise, Adeline, I'll never miss another day of your life. Not one more. She smiled sleepily. You pinky promise? He laughed softly, tears still streaming. Yes, pinky promise. He held out his little finger, and she hooked hers around it with the serious determination only a 6-year-old could have. Then you can stay, she murmured as her eyes began to close again. Mason stayed right where he was, holding her hand as she drifted back into sleep. He could feel her small fingers twitching lightly in his palm, a fragile, beautiful reminder that she was real, that she was his. As he sat there, he realized this was more than just a reunion. It was redemption, a second chance given by fate, wrapped in a child's forgiveness. The faint sound of her breathing filled the room like music, and Mason whispered into the silence, Thank you for finding me, even when I didn't know I was lost. Tears slipped down his cheeks once more, but this time they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of peace. In that sacred, quiet moment, the man who had spent his life chasing power finally found the only treasure that truly mattered, a daughter's love. And with her in his arms, Mason Carter felt richer than he had ever been. The days that followed felt like sunlight slowly breaking through years of darkness. What once had been cold and silent, Mason Carter's grand mansion, with its marble floors and echoing halls, now rang with the soft sounds of laughter, tiny footsteps, and a 6-year-old's endless curiosity. When Lily and Adeline moved in temporarily for her recovery, Mason's world changed in ways money could never buy. The place that once echoed with loneliness now carried the sweet hum of family. Each morning, Mason woke before the sun, determined to make breakfast for his little girl. He'd never cooked in his life, but he tried. Oh, how he tried. Flour on the counter, burnt pancakes, syrup on the ceiling. And yet, Adeline would giggle every single time. It's okay, Daddy, she'd say between laughs. It's the thought that counts. Those words would make Mason smile through the mess, his heart swelling with pride. He learned to braid her hair, terribly at first. His fingers tangled the strands into something that looked more like a bird's nest than a braid. But Adeline would beam anyway. You're getting better, she'd say seriously, inspecting it in the mirror. He'd laugh. You think so? Yes, she'd reply, because you didn't give up. And each night Mason would sit beside her tiny bed, reading fairy tales until her eyelids fluttered shut. Sometimes she'd ask him to make up stories, and he'd tell her tales about brave girls who changed the world and daddies who never stopped looking for their children. When she fell asleep, he'd linger there for a while, brushing a strand of hair from her face, memorizing every little detail, the curve of her cheeks, the rise and fall of her breath. Every second with her filled the cracks in his heart that had been empty for years. Lily, too, began to soften. At first, she was distant, unsure, afraid that the wounds between them could never heal. But Mason was different now. Gone was the cold, work-obsessed man who once lived for profit and deadlines. This Mason laughed easily, listened patiently, and made time for what truly mattered. One evening, they sat together on the patio watching Adeline chase fireflies across the garden. The setting sun painted the sky gold, and for the first time in years, Lily smiled without holding back. "She's happy," she whispered. "She deserves to be," Mason replied. "You both do." Lily looked at him, her voice trembling. "You've changed, Mason." He smiled softly, his gaze fixed on their daughter. "No, I just finally realized what I almost lost." A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that didn't need words. For so long they had lived apart, carrying regrets like heavy chains. But now, sitting side by side, watching their daughter's laughter fill the air, those chains began to fall away. Mason started taking breaks from work, something his staff had never seen before. He'd show up late to meetings because Adeline wanted to show me her drawing, or she asked me to watch her magic trick. No deal, no empire, no contract felt more important than the sound of her calling, "Daddy, look at me." He framed her first drawing, the same one she made in the hospital, with the three of them holding hands. It now hung proudly in his office above the desk, where once only success mattered. Now it reminded him of what truly did. At night, the three of them would have dinner together, sometimes quiet, sometimes messy, sometimes full of laughter that carried through the halls like music. Every day stitched the torn pieces of their story together. Father, mother, daughter, each one healing a little more than the last. Mason learned that love wasn't grand gestures or luxury gifts. It was sitting at the breakfast table eating burnt pancakes together. It was wiping chocolate from a child's face and watching her giggle. It was forgiveness whispered between tired smiles. One night, as he tucked Adeline into bed, she looked up at him and said softly, "Daddy, do families ever stop loving each other?" He smiled, brushing her hair from her forehead. "No, sweetheart. Real families find their way back, no matter how far they've gone." Her eyes shone as she whispered, "Then we're real." Mason's voice broke as he kissed her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, we're as real as it gets." And as he walked out of her room, Lily waiting for him at the door with a quiet smile, Mason finally understood something he never had before. That healing wasn't found in hospitals or wealth or time. It was found in laughter echoing through once empty halls, in love reborn after years of loss, and in the tiny hands that reminded him what life was truly about. The mansion that had once been a lonely monument to success had finally become a home, warm, messy, alive, filled with love, forgiveness, and the sound of a family beginning again. Months later, Mason took Adeline back to the same park where fate reunited them. They sat near the fountain watching other kids play. Adeline looked up at him and said, "Daddy, can we stay here forever?" He smiled, pulling her close. "Forever and always, sweetheart." Lily stood nearby, smiling through tears. They were a family again, not perfect, but whole. As the sun set behind them, Mason realized that true wealth isn't counted in dollars, but in hearts. And in a world chasing power and success, one fainting little girl reminded him, sometimes life's richest blessings come from the people we almost lost.